It's increasingly clear, of course, that the huge swathes of the media that have been indulging in utterly slavish support of both Boris Johnson and previously Brexit. I don't think you can separate the two, can you? We can at least all agree about that. It's boiled our brains. We've forgotten what proper journalism looks like. The front page of a Daily Mail that's critical of a Conservative government. I mean, what is this rabbit hole down which we've fallen? Piers Morgan on Good Morning Britain every day, holding government ministers to account, having spent the last couple of years effectively saying that we need to support them even though they're lying through their teeth. I'm sure he'd object to that representation, so I should probably acknowledge that immediately. And now, of course, proving to be one of the government's most ardent scrutineers, people can't process it. So they think that they're being let down. Hang on a minute, they say to the editors of some newspapers and indeed some broadcasters, you've been utterly slavish in your support of Boris Johnson for the last God knows how many months and years. Hang on a minute, you've been feeding us nonsense about the European Union. Why are you now suddenly actually shining a light into some darker corners of this government's performance? It's absolutely outrageous. And it leads inevitably, I think, to people in the industry now beginning to suggest, and I've seen it in the strangest of places, now beginning to suggest that we should all stop asking questions, which would be great if this was North Korea, but it's not. So we have to, and we have done, and among the answers we've received is one that was, I think, utterly and completely confirmed by last night's panorama on the BBC. The NHS was spectacularly ill-equipped to cope with this crisis. We know that because doctors rang up and told us. But can I run something by you? You know how much I enjoy, 90% of the time, how much I enjoy being on Twitter in particular. But it's like an extension of being a phone-in host, except you have a little bit less power, I suppose, on Twitter than you do when you're a phone-in host. But it means you constantly get the chance to see where other people are coming from. And one of the most interesting things I've seen in the last few weeks, and I hope this is as interesting to you as it is to me, I think it will be, was when we were taking calls from doctor after doctor after doctor, nurse after nurse after nurse, carer after carer after carer, paramedic after paramedic after paramedic, telling us about shortages, telling us about gowns, telling us about visors, telling us about swabs, telling us about body bags, telling us about pretty much every item of so-called personal protective equipment being in short supply. Something really strange emerged. I don't think it popped up on air. My apologies if it did. In a minute I shall allow myself a brief boast, if that's the right word, about something that indeed did pop up on air and got, as a joke, in fact. I think I made it as a joke, and it turned out to be true. But we were taking all those calls, and I saw some tweets, I don't think we took a call on this, suggesting that in order to balance the story, we needed to talk to medics who did have enough equipment. You remember there was that Conservative MP whose name escapes me, who tweeted a picture, and I'm very, very reluctant to criticise her unduly, because she had literally just finished a shift as a nurse in an NHS hospital, but she tweeted a picture of herself wearing a mask with the line in it, plenty, or something very close to, plenty of PPE, despite media reports. Now, if you are mad enough or kind enough to listen to this programme on a regular basis, you'll know that I have something of an obsession with skeleton keys and Rosetta Stones, penny drop moments. And it took me a while, even though I spoke to you about that MP at the time, it took me a while to work out why I thought that was so significant. And I realised why I thought that was so significant when I started seeing this line of argument emerging. And it's a really frightening line of argument. The idea that if you're having a conversation about shortages, you also need to include people that haven't suffered from shortages is about as close to bogus as I can currently conceive. And these were not mad people. These were not accounts with 16 numbers in their name and a picture of a dog or the flag of St. George as their avatar. These were, to all intents and purposes, real, rational, and decent people. And they had ended up in this place, obviously, because the idea that Boris Johnson is an almighty pudding is far too huge a concept for them to grasp, because he's become the embodiment of their last two votes in the referendum and in the general election. So you just can't go there yet. And because you just can't go there yet, you search, you desperately seek something that you can wave like a little flag when presented with reality. And the reality was, and probably will be, immense shortages of personal protective equipment for the people that, well, I think those claps on Thursday night, although they're valuable and they make us all feel better, they ring increasingly hollow, don't they, when you learn more and more and more about how profoundly these people have been let down by our political masters. But you need a little flag. So reality says shortages, tribalism, even, I'm afraid, cultishness says, oh, some people have got a gown. Why don't you mention that to balance out the story? Which is, I mean, surely, once you've thought about it, we can all agree, utterly absurd. The only circumstances in which people who have got enough equipment would become part of a balanced debate would be if people were claiming that there wasn't any. Do you see what I mean? If I came on the radio and said, it's absolutely awful, there is not a single gown in Britain, there is not a single visor in Britain, there is not a single surgical face mask in Britain, then you would quite rightly queue up to call me from theatres and from hospitals and surgeries to say to me, well, I've got one, James, you're talking utter twaddle. But if I say, via you as a doctor or a nurse, there is a shortage of masks, there is no room in that debate for somebody to come in and say, well, I've got one. It would be, you know, just think about it for a moment. It would be a bit like standing up and saying, well, there's a lot of poor people over there. There's a lot of people over there who haven't got any money. And then a rich bloke stands up and says, well, I've got plenty of money. You must be talking nonsense. Do you see? And the reason I'm labouring the point slightly is precisely because of the respect I have for some of the people that were making this point or this supposed point in the context of social media. There is a massive shortage of X. Okay, loads and loads of people have not got enough X. Oh, well, here's a bloke that's got enough X. That means that they must be lying, or they must be exaggerating, or they must be cancelled out by the fact that a doctor over there does have everything he needs. And that's why, her name will come to me in a moment if it hasn't already been tweeted to me. That's why that MP who just finished a shift in a NHS hospital as a nurse troubled me so deeply, because not only when she added that little line, despite media reports, was she handing out these pathetic, fraudulent little flags that you're supposed to wave when presented with evidence of shortages. Somebody having something is not relevant to the question of whether somebody else has it. And so she's handing out these pathetic, fraudulent little flags, and decent people are picking them up and waving them. And this isn't like Brexit. This is life and death. This is doctors and nurses on the front line who we spend a minute every Thursday night apparently worshipping, being sent to war without the weapons that they need. And so that little line, despite media reports, that's why it troubled me so much. And I didn't realise until this morning when I read reports of last night's Panorama, I finally understood why that was such an obnoxious intervention. Because the way they sought to address reports of shortages was by saying some people don't have any shortages. And if that doesn't chill you to your core, then, well, nothing will, because it means that even now, even in the face of a death toll, which is estimated now to be around the 44,000 mark, the excess deaths linked to COVID-19, once you include non-hospital deaths, the best available estimates, the Financial Times is doing sterling work on this, are now up to 44,000. We are poised to become one of the worst, if not the worst, certainly probably the worst in Europe, one of the very worst in the world. We've got a Prime Minister trying to describe elements of it as an apparent success, and we've got a political movement rhetorical attempt to claim that because a doctor over there has got a visor, then the doctor over there who hasn't got a visor should somehow be ignored or even insulted. And that's where we are. And that, I'm afraid, is why some people now are getting increasingly desperate in their calls for criticism and scrutiny of this government to be somehow stopped. These occasionally well-meaning, but generally quite North Korean calls for journalists to stop doing journalism because the public has actually forgotten what it looks like. If you had been on for the last 3.5, 4 years, an unleavened diet of Daily Telegraph, Daily Express, Daily Mail, Sunday Times inspired, what's the word I'm looking for, because it's not reporting, propagandizing, then you will not know what day it is at the moment, because the truth is beginning to emerge about these people and about their politics and about this project. But we've spent so long down the rabbit hole, we've forgotten what daylight looks like. Let me confine today's first conversation to this question of PPE. Panorama reported last night that the failure to collect stocks went back a decade. Even as recently as June, they were warned last June that they needed gowns. Guess how many they went out and bought as a direct result of that intervention? Yeah, you're right. Absolutely zilch. Staff still say that they're being put at risk because of the shortage of personal protective equipment. And the Daily Mail, the newspaper which under its last editor essentially became a cheerleader for attacks on judges, for attacks on parliamentary democracy, for attacks on academia, for attacks on scrutiny and criticism. They report today, under their newish editor, Doctors' PPE desperation. Desperation. The Health Secretary being interviewed today on Nick's show and elsewhere, essentially still trying to spin and deny what doctors are telling us. And if you think I'm exaggerating when I tell you that if they see an opportunity to try to blame the doctors and nurses currently risking their lives for the failures of political leadership, if you think that these people, both in politics and in parts of the media, wouldn't turn on doctors and nurses as viciously and as vilely as they turn on unemployed people, foreign people, Muslims, firefighters, if you think they wouldn't try to pin this debacle on the doctors and nurses straining every sinew to get us through it with a minimum number of casualties, then you, I'm afraid, have forgotten what happened during the last doctors' strike.